Niko considered herself a very happy person. At 23 years old, she had a job she loved, a place to call home, and a wonderful partner. Niko worked as a nurse in a hospital. She loved this profession since she was a child. Medicine had always fascinated her, and initially she had thought about becoming a doctor. However, later she realized that getting into a medical university would be incredibly difficult for her, considering the lack of money for tutors or paid tuition. That's why Niko decided to study to become a nurse. During studying at a nursing school, Niko fell in love for the first time in her life. Her chosen one, Doug, was 3 years older than Niko, and he studied at medical college. He was good-looking, tall, athletic, with slightly curly blonde hair and cheerful green eyes. Doug was the captain of the college sports team and represented the institution in various competitions, so it was no surprise that he was popular with girls. It's difficult to say why Doug chose Niko among his many loyal fans. Later, Niko called this her personal bad luck, but at the beginning she was convinced that she was favoured by destiny. Regardless, towards the end of Niko's second year, Doug asked her out and she agreed. Their relationship was forceful, although more like a friendship. Niko and Doug studied together for the session, spent a long time talking, going for walks, watching movies and going to cafes. In short, they led the ordinary lives of young people who were curious about the world. At that time, Niko lived with her parents and her older brother Tom, and then trouble arrived for them. Niko's grandmother fell ill. Helen was a strict, intelligent, well-read and demanding woman. Recently she lived alone, but Tom and Niko visited her from time to time. But when it became apparent that Helen couldn't physically live alone, the family decided that Niko would take care of her. The thing was, the grandmother always favoured the granddaughter more than her grandson. It was hard to say what had led to such a different attitude to the children, but the fact remained. Besides, Niko was to inherit Helen's wonderful 2-bedroom apartment in the centre of the city too. The will had been written several years ago. The elderly woman only required help with household problems and occasional medical assistance, such as administering medication or calling the doctor. Niko, who was studying to be a nurse, saw this as a perfect opportunity to gain practical experience. The girl agreed with her family's opinion and happily moved to her grandmother's house before the new school year began. As a result, she and Doug couldn't meet as frequently as before. Niko's studies consumed a significant amount of her time. After her classes, she rushed home to heat up food and feed her grandmother, who had difficulty doing so herself. Afterward, Niko would focus on studying for the next day's lessons and preparing for her practical training. Doug also had a heavier workload compared to before. During the summer, he took a job at the city hospital. Due to the shortage of staff, Doug often worked a day shift with the next night shift. This schedule left little opportunity for them to have proper meetings. They had to rely on phone calls and occasional moments to communicate via the internet. But Niko wasn't upset that she had to take care of her grandmother. She had only seen kindness from her throughout her life, and she was sincerely grateful for the will written in her name. However, after a few months of this lifestyle, Doug started to complain. He didn't like that when he had a spare time, he and Niko didn't always have a date. If the grandmother at that time required care, the girl stayed with her. The girl was at a loss as to what to do. On one hand, she couldn't leave her grandmother alone, especially during moments when she was particularly worried about her condition. On the other hand, she understood that Doug was right in some way too. Niko tried her best to balance everything in her life. It reached a point where she started skipping some school classes and sacrificing sleep to be with Doug, take care of her grandmother, and maintain good grades. However, all good things come to an end, and Niko and Doug's romance ended as well. One day, Niko was sent to practice in the department where Doug worked. The girl was happy because today they would work together since he was on duty that day. The girl decided not to tell Doug about this before, so to make a surprise. But there was a surprise for her too. When Niko entered the head nurse's office, she caught Doug kissing her. angry and hurt, Niko turned and left for the manipulation room. She didn't speak to Doug again and avoided looking in his direction. On the outside, she seemed like a piece of ice, but deep inside, her hurt feelings raged. It was difficult for Niko to endure such betrayal. It was even harder for Niko to accept that her beloved grandmother's life was coming to an end. As a future medical professional, Niko couldn't deny the reality, no matter how much she wished otherwise. Watching her grandmother slowly fade away, Niko realized that the end was near. She even put her studies on hold, explaining the situation to the nursing school administration, and devoted herself to her grandmother at her last hours on earth. When Helen passed away, Niko felt as if a part of her heart and soul had left with her. Of course, life went on, but Niko was in no rush to fall in love again. She had made a permanent decision to spend, if not her entire life, a significant period in solitude to avoid being betrayed. This decision allowed Niko to focus on her studies, pursue her favourite hobbies, rest well, and enjoy life as much as possible, given her circumstances. When Niko graduated from medical school, she secured a job in another city hospital, deliberately avoiding any place where she might run into Doug. Niko enjoyed her job as a nurse, despite the challenging and often underappreciated nature of the work. The young woman always arrived at work in a good mood, with light makeup and a hint of perfume. With her tall, slender figure and well-groomed appearance, she caught the attention of men around her. But alas, the heart of this beauty was as cold as ice. Niko made it clear to numerous potential suitors that she was not interested in affairs. The young woman maintained this stance for several years, until one day she met Ryan. They met purely by chance at the entrance of a hospital. Ryan was there with his mother for an examination and asked Niko for directions to the right room. It turned out that Niko was also going there to get results of the patients in her department. On the way, Niko and Ryan smiled hesitantly at each other, but did not dare to speak. But in front of the door of the office, when the young man's mother had already gone to the appointment, a conversation began between them. Niko felt like she had been searching for a man like Ryan her entire life. He was intelligent, with a sparkling sense of humour, and most importantly, he was a wonderful son. Ryan personally brought his mother to the doctor, even though she wasn't a weak or elderly woman. Niko admired how caring he was, because she remembered perfectly well how Doug reacted when she took care of her grandmother. Ryan took Niko's phone number, and 2 days later they met in the park for a casual walk and to listen to the birds singing. Ryan continued to impress Niko with his knowledge, hobbies and interests. Niko, on the other hand, behaved more modestly. It had been so long since she had been on a real date that sometimes she didn't know what to talk about with Ryan. She had a feeling that he wouldn't call her for a second meeting at any cost. But Niko was wrong. Ryan not only invited her for a second and third date, but he also expressed his desire to be in a committed relationship. He liked Niko's quiet beauty, her few words, her restraint, and her intelligence. It took some time for the young woman to believe in his feelings. She was afraid of repeating the mistakes she made with Doug, so she kept Ryan at a distance while still maintaining a connection. Only after 6 months did Niko start to feel more at ease with Ryan, trusting him and genuinely laughing with him. Ryan noticed the positive changes in their relationship and sincerely enjoyed them. After dating for a little over a year, Ryan casually slipped in a proposal for them to start living together. Niko liked the idea, especially since she had her own apartment. The young couple decided to move in together right away, just in time for the upcoming New Year, a time of miracles and magic. Niko felt like she was living in a Disney princess movie, wanting to sing and dance. Niko hurriedly put on her slippers and went to the kitchen. Ryan would be home from work in 2 hours, and she wanted to prepare a home-cooked roast in clay pots before he arrived. She always tried to impress him with her cooking and housekeeping skills, as she knew that the men appreciated these qualities in girls. Ryan returned from work and immediately hugged and kissed Niko. "Hi, I missed you. And what is that delicious smell? You're my domestic fairy. I think even if you cook something half raw, it will still taste wonderful. But that's not what I wanted to talk to you about." "I'm all ears," Niko replied, stirring her cooking in a salad bowl and gesturing for Ryan to sit down and share everything with her. Ryan hesitated for a moment and then began to recount an issue in his family. It turned out that there were constant conflicts between his mother and grandmother. Grandmother, as easy to guess, was his mother's mother-in-law, the mother of his long-deceased father. The two women never found common ground, neither when Ryan's father was alive nor after his death. Grandma Martha was a powerful and stubborn woman, yet calm as a rock. Once she decided to do something, she stood her ground. On the other hand, Ryan's mother, despite her mature years, still disliked Martha's categorical nature and some of her habits. Furthermore, they harboured another family secret, a kind of skeleton in the closet. After Ryan's father passed away, his widow discovered that all the property was not registered in her late husband's name, but in his mother's name. Even the apartment in the city where the family lived before the tragedy belonged to Grandma Martha. This greatly displeased Ryan's mother. Initially, she tried to convince Martha to transfer all the assets to her grandson, arguing that the boy was growing up and should at least have a roof over his head. But Martha calmly responded that she had no intention of evicting anyone. "Live where you lived, but I will remain the owner." Lynette, Ryan's mother, didn't like this, but she couldn't do anything about it. At times she became nervous, crying and shouting that the old woman wanted to leave her and her grandson with nothing. She feared that Martha would suddenly go mad and transfer the living space to a cat shelter, or even leave it to a stranger. The grandmother always dismissed such accusations and told Ryan not to believe his mother regarding this matter. But there was another reason for keeping this apartment in her name. Martha lived outside the city in a small but cosy house, inherited from her own parents. However, getting medical care was a real challenge there. To see a doctor, the elderly woman had to make arrangements in advance with one of the local men to take her to town and then bring her back. Sometimes it took several days for consultations and treatment, so the elderly woman would stay overnight in the apartment in the city, enduring the constant complaints from Lynette that she was embarrassing them. The elderly woman realized that she was an unwelcome guest in the family, but where could she go? Her friends had suggested more than once that she kick out her daughter-in-law, as her grandson was grown up and capable of earning his own money for a place to live. Then she could rent out the empty apartment and use the money to visit town as much as she desired. However, Martha couldn't or didn't want to do that to Ryan, so she continued to tolerate her daughter-in-law's dislike and occasionally spent the night in her own apartment, feeling herself like a stray dog allowed on the doorstep, but at any moment could be chased away with a broom. Shortly before the new year, Grandma Martha fell ill in her village. Concerned neighbours called an ambulance and she was taken to the hospital in the city. She spent 10 days there, and everything that could be done for her had already been done. As the head of the therapeutic department where the old woman was treated said, there was no remedy for old age. The grandmother began to prepare for her discharge. However, she had no way of getting back to her native village. Ryan's car had been parked for a long time awaiting repairs that he couldn't afford now. The neighbours couldn't bring the elderly woman home for their own reasons. So she decided, said Ryan, letting out a particularly sorrowful sigh, to spend a few days in her own apartment and celebrate the new year with Mum. Of course, Ryan's mother strongly objected, and she had her reasons. The main issue was that after the death of her spouse many years ago, she never lived as a hermit. And now she had a serious long-term relationship, and her partner had been living with her for 6 months. They had big plans for a New Year's Eve party, and Martha's presence did not align with them. That's why Ryan decided to ask Niko for a small favour, to have his grandmother stay at her apartment for the New Year's holidays, along with him. This way, they would solve two problems. The elderly woman would have a place to stay, and Ryan's mother could spend time with her partner and their guests without any interference. Niko agreed immediately. She was shocked by the fact that Ryan's mother could kick an elderly woman out of her own home, especially on New Year's Eve. She didn't even think about the shamefulness of such an act. However, Niko, being a cultured girl, didn't voice these thoughts aloud. Together with Ryan, they discussed the details of where Grandma Martha would sleep, what she could and couldn't eat from the festive table, her preferences and her intolerances. During this talk, the young woman was surprised to find out that Ryan knew very little about his own grandmother. He didn't know her taste preferences, allergies, or even her specific health conditions. However, Niko quickly attributed his lack of knowledge to the fact that not everyone has a medical background like her. Preparations for Martha's arrival began immediately. Niko quickly prepared a bed for her on the sofa in the spare bedroom. Strangely, the young woman felt happy. Perhaps it reminded her of her own grandmother Helen. Whatever the reason, she was truly eager to meet Martha. Ryan brought his grandmother the next day, in the evening. When Niko saw the timid old woman entering the hallway, she immediately went to her and helped her sit on the poof, making it more comfortable for her to take off her boots. Martha smiled shyly and tried to insist that she could do it herself, but Niko didn't listen. With the skill and experience gained from caring for her own elderly relative, she quickly assisted the elderly woman in undressing and removing her shoes. Martha was unaccustomed to such care and constantly expressed her gratitude to Niko. The young woman felt a bit uncomfortable, as she didn't feel like she had done anything particularly significant or worthy of such praise. Meanwhile, Ryan didn't show much gallantry towards his own grandmother. He simply led her to the room, showed her the sofa, reminded her that dinner would be served when Niko called everyone to the kitchen, and then left the room. Seeing such greeting, Niko decided to take matters into her own hands. She entered her grandmother's room with a friendly smile and inquired about her comfort, whether there was a draught from the window, her preferred TV programs, and if she needed anything else in general. Once again, the elderly woman was taken aback by such kindness and acceptance. She thanked Niko sincerely, just as she had done a minute earlier, and politely asked her not to bother too much. As for Ryan, he was dissatisfied with the increased attention his girlfriend was giving to his grandmother. It even seemed to Niko that he was jealous and wanted to quickly whisk her away whenever she came into her room. A few days later, Niko came home from work and was stunned. She found Martha engaged in crafting, and the atmosphere in the apartment was different from the morning when Niko and Ryan had rushed off to work. The windows were covered with garlands, and there was a decorated Christmas tree in the living room. In short, the apartment finally had a festive atmosphere. While Niko quietly admired the decorations, Ryan arrived home too. However, he did not share his girlfriend's enthusiasm for what he saw, and advised his own grandmother to rest more instead of cluttering the space with unnecessary stuff. To avoid quarrelling with her beloved, Niko chose to retreat to the kitchen to prepare dinner. However, she was upset with his insensitivity and lack of appreciation for the other person's work. Niko started preparing dinner in the kitchen, while Ryan, tired from his work, lounged on the sofa in front of the TV. It was an ordinary evening, almost like a family gathering. The grandmother, who did not want to sit idly by, entered the kitchen and, despite Niko's objections, actively participated in the cooking. Throughout, Marta talked incessantly, sharing stories that alternately made Niko happy, sad, and sometimes even frightened. Niko learned from Martha that she was born and raised in the same small village where their family house still stood. She married and gave birth to her son Paul there. She worked as a math teacher at the local village school, and her husband worked on the farm. They always dreamed that their only son would have the best in life. That's why at the first opportunity, they bought Paul an apartment in the city so that he could study and live there. Paul studied averagely, finished a technical school, and started working. A few years later, Paul got married, and his father passed away. "I never really liked Lynette, but I never said a bad word about her," Martha said. "The apartment was registered to me because my husband was afraid that our naive son would squander it by marrying some swindler, while we were working so hard to earn money for it. Lynette threatened, demanded to change documents, and then just 6 months after my husband's death, Paul passed away too. After that, Lynette directed all her anger towards me, demanding that the apartment be transferred to her name immediately. Even though it was decided a long time ago that Ryan would inherit the apartment after my death, Lynette was angry with that. She constantly caused trouble and prevented me from entering the apartment. Do you think I don't understand? Why can't I spend the night in the apartment I bought with my own money for my son?" Martha said quietly as she kneaded the dough for the pie. "No, I understand everything clearly. Lynette is using my apartment for her own enjoyment. She sent Ryan to get me, while she will spend time with her boyfriend in the apartment. I apologize for bothering you with our family troubles." "You're not bothering me at all," Niko protested eagerly. "You can stay here as long as you want. Do you know how much you remind me of my grandmother Helen?" Martha smiled and went back to kneading the dough for the pie. She calmly and instructively told Niko that her years as a school teacher had not been in vain, and that she could see through people. She assured Niko that she had a pure and innocent soul, and hoped that fate would reward her for her kindness and sincerity. Niko smiled awkwardly, rubbing the edge of the tablecloth, and thought that her reward, Ryan, was watching TV in the next room. "Well, my dear, I understand everything," the elderly woman continued. "Wasn't I ever young, and didn't remember how much I wanted to be alone with my beloved? And here I am now, an old woman with my own problems and ailments. But I won't be here long to embarrass you. In a couple of days I'll go to my village. Winter is so nice there. The ice on the river is thick and strong, so you can skate on it. My village can't compare to your city. Oh, by the way, why don't you take Ryan and visit me in the village? Whenever you have a free moment, come and be my dear guests in my house. It's also nice there in the summer. The nearby forest is full of berries, and the orchard has fragrant apples and pears. And the air, oh, what air! Not like here. In short, you must come with Ryan as soon as you can." Impressed by stories, Niko even covered her eyes with pleasure. If it were up to her, she would go to the village right now, but unfortunately there was no such opportunity. "Okay, we will definitely visit you at your village. But now tell me, please, what's wrong with your health? What happened that caused you to be hospitalized?" The old woman looked at her with surprise, raising her bright, yet not faded eyes. "Honey, this is the first time I've met someone who's interested in hearing about other people's ailments." "Well, I'm a nurse." Niko tried to brush it off as a joke. "But still, what happened? I also work in a hospital, but a different one. Maybe it would have been better for you to come to us or contact our doctors. They will help to advise you." Martha briefly recounted to Niko the reasons for her health issues, without going into detail. "Well, we'll fight for you," Niko assured the elderly woman with a confident smile. "We'll treat you in our hospital next time. You will be okay. We'll even find you a groom, if you like." The two women burst into loud laughter. Ryan came out of the living room, drawn away from watching TV by their laughter. He asked when dinner would be, and was lovingly seated at the table. After dinner, Ryan announced that he had received a work-related message and needed to urgently attend to an incident. This occasionally happened in his position. Martha and Niko escorted the young man to the door and then sat down to watch an old movie on TV, the same one Ryan had been watching before. From the outside, the two women appeared to be like a grandmother and her granddaughter, reminiscing about the past and exchanging opinions about the present. Suddenly, Martha looked at Niko, who was engrossed in watching the plot unfold on the screen and cheering for her heroes, and asked her, "Niko, do you have any communication with Ryan's mother? Do you know each other?" "No," Niko shrugged her shoulders. "We saw each other once on the day at the hospital, and then only briefly." "I see." The elderly woman shook her head thoughtfully. "The only advice I can give you from my perspective and life experience is to keep your distance from her. Don't get too close, Niko. She is not a kind person and jealous. You should always be wary. Don't think I'm an old hag talking nonsense about her. I've lived a long life and not a happy one. I remember many things about her that she has long forgotten. You're a good girl, Niko. Good and conscientious. That's the kind of girl that girls like Lynette choose as their victim. Just remember that and be on your guard." The next day, the three of them celebrated New Year's Eve together. Ryan dressed in a shirt and tie for the occasion, Niko in a nice dress, and of course Grandma Martha. They hugged each other, exchanged wishes for happiness and joy, and called friends, colleagues and acquaintances, sending and receiving various cards through messengers. The three of them sat like that until midnight, and then Martha went to bed, saying she was tired from the whole day. Ryan and Niko were left alone. After watching a few more programs on TV, they prepared to rest. Ryan suggested going out onto the balcony, standing for a while, watching the fireworks and talking. Niko nodded silently, quickly put on her coat, and within a couple of minutes she was standing on the balcony of her apartment, next to her boyfriend. "Happy New Year! Happy New Year!" came the voices from the street, tempting them to join the lively crowd lighting fireworks, holding sparklers and uncorking bottles of champagne. But Ryan remained silent, and Niko stayed silent beside him. Finally, the man began speaking cautiously, as if he were a swimmer, unsure if the river he had chosen had any hidden currents. "Niko, we've known each other for a long time, and I've been thinking about this for a while. I've decided that I've had enough of meeting occasionally. I realized that I need you in my life all the time. Will you marry me?" Niko was beyond happy. Her favourite man had just proposed to her, and on New Year's Eve, no less. The young woman nodded enthusiastically, showing Ryan that his proposal had found a great response in her heart. The young man smiled, hugged Niko, and pulled her close to him. They went back inside and continued discussing their future life together as a family. That night, Niko and Ryan couldn't sleep until the early hours of the morning. They shared their dreams and wishes, not holding back anything that came to their minds. They fantasized about a country house, having 2 children of different genders, regular family trips to the sea, and of course a bigger apartment. Ryan suggested selling her small 2-bedroom apartment and using the money to upgrade to a 3-bedroom apartment, as it would be more convenient with children. Niko agreed with him, as she had already thought about it herself. In short, this New Year's night was a success for Niko, as was the entire first day of the year. She didn't have to go to work, so she flew around the apartment, recounting every detail of their pleasant night conversation to Martha. The elderly woman listened to Niko with a smile, congratulated her from the bottom of her heart, and reminded her once again that she was eagerly awaiting her visit to her village. The elderly lady left for her village on January 2nd. As she got into the car of her village acquaintances, she waved goodbye, and Niko sighed as she watched the car drive away. She felt comfortable and free with Grandma Martha. The thought crossed her mind that she wouldn't mind living under the same roof with this nice elderly woman for a while longer. She hadn't grown tired of her company at all. A few days later, when Niko was preparing dinner, Ryan came back from work unexpectedly. "Hello, my honey," greeted the young man. "I have news for you. My mum wants to meet you, so don't make any plans for tonight. No objections, please." "Well, don't worry. There are no objections at all." Niko removed the apron she had been wearing in the kitchen to prevent staining her clothes. She turned off the oven where she had been roasting meat. From the start of their life together, she did not want to argue with Ryan. If Lynette wanted to see her, Niko felt it was best to go along with her desire. After all, she gave birth to and raised Niko's future husband, which meant a lot. The visit to Niko's future mother-in-law took place that evening. She met her son and Niko in a terry cloth robe with an empty table. It was clear that no one was going to make a fuss about the son's intention to marry. First, Lynette asked Niko about her parents, childhood, work, and career prospects. These were the usual questions, but Niko felt that each of her answers was being carefully evaluated against some ideal image. Niko tried to answer clearly and completely, hoping to satisfy Ryan and his mother. But Ryan seemed indifferent to all this situation. He wandered around the apartment absent-mindedly, clearly showing that he wanted a snack, and he hadn't had time to eat at Niko's home. Finally, he had to order a couple of large pizzas from the nearest eatery because there was nothing to eat in the apartment. After the meal, the communication, or rather the interview, continued, but not as intensely. An hour later, Ryan's mother learned everything she wanted to know about Niko, and without any remorse, she told them that they were free to go because her man was due back from work any minute. Niko and Ryan put on their coats in silence and left. This visit left a very heavy impression on the girl. But the next weekend was entirely different. Ryan fulfilled his promise and took Niko to the village to visit his grandmother. The elderly woman was overjoyed and treated them like dear guests. She set a sumptuous table, and it was a desired relief after the cold meeting at Lynette's. Ryan left his bride at his grandmother's house, citing important work matters. He promised to come back for Niko in the evening, but only managed to arrive the next day. If Martha hadn't been such a wonderful conversationalist, it would have been hard for Niko to spend time with her. However, the two women found a common language, and time flew by unnoticed. From that moment on, whenever Niko had spare time, she immediately informed her fiancé and went with him to the village to visit Martha. She enjoyed those trips even in Ryan's absence. Their weekends and work shifts didn't always align, but sometimes Ryan accompanied her. When Martha needed to go to the city for an examination next time, the question of where she would stay didn't even arise. Niko said right away that she would be happy to shelter her groom's grandmother, and she didn't agree with other options. Time passed, and the wedding date approached. Ryan and Niko decided to have the wedding in the summer, when the weather would be warm and pleasant. While it was still rainy March outside, they began preparing for this momentous event. Niko continued to spend all weekends in the village. She had become attached to that quiet place and considered it her second home. Additionally, the elderly woman's health had worsened slightly, so Niko constantly brought her new medicines and devices to monitor her health. Then came April, as rainy as March. Grandma Martha's condition worsened, and it was decided to hospitalize her, this time in the hospital where Niko worked. After the first check, it became apparent that the elderly woman's health had significantly worsened since her last examination. When Niko was going through her medical records, she caught herself thinking that she had reacted calmly to these diagnoses when she read them in other people's medical records, but now she couldn't hold back her tears. Is Grandma Martha going to leave them any time soon? No, it's absolutely impossible. She has to wait for Ryan's wedding, meet her great-grandchildren in her village, and delight them with delicious food and funny jokes. Niko was also struck by her future mother-in-law's treatment of Martha's health. Lynette seemed to have no sympathy or intention to visit the sick woman. She simply dryly asked her son, "Will you leave this world soon?" Ryan then tried to justify his mum, saying that she was joking, but Niko didn't find it funny at all. Every morning, Niko came to work with a sense of dread, and the first thing she did was check for updates on Martha's health. Unfortunately, the news was never good. The elderly woman felt worse and heavier with each passing day. One early morning, when Niko arrived at work half an hour early, as usual, to see Martha before her shift began, the elderly woman asked her to sit down in a chair in her room. Niko did as the grandmother asked, but she didn't like the request itself. "Don't worry," the elderly woman said clearly, as if she were arguing with a stubborn schoolboy. "Don't worry about me, please. I'm not blind, and I see who truly cares for me. My grandson is a true son of his mother, and he doesn't show any concern for his grandmother. Lynette is ridiculous to talk about. She's only coming to the funeral to make sure I'm done. A notary is coming here today at 10 a.m. A friend of mine arranged it, as I requested. I've decided to give you the deed to my apartment and house. My property shouldn't go to Lynette or Ryan, who isn't a bad guy, but he is too influenced by his mother. He'll squander it all if given the chance. No, I'd rather leave it to you." Martha sighed heavily and looked directly into Niko's eyes, covering her hand with her dry palm. "And the last, I shouldn't say this, but take a good look at Ryan before you tell him yes. It's a woman's intuition. He's my grandson, but alas, I see that his mother's influence is stronger than his father's. You deserve to be happy. Be happy, my dear. Everything will be okay." Niko tried to object, but Martha silenced her with a single gesture. She had made up her mind, and it was her final decision, unwavering. The notary arrived at exactly 10 o'clock and formalized everything as required. Niko became the owner of all Grandma Martha's property, and by evening the elderly lady was gone. At the funeral, Niko saw Lynette's lovely light smile and Ryan's calm demeanour. They didn't know about the will yet, but later, when they found out that, there was a huge scandal. Lynette, forgetting all decorum, shouted and threatened to sue her future daughter-in-law if she didn't return the apartment that she had been waiting for so many years. Ryan reacted more calmly, although Niko could tell from his face that he was uncomfortable. The girl reassured her groom that they would soon be married and that they would share all the property. He shrugged uncertainly and left, explaining that he had to go to work. Niko didn't specify what kind of work could be done on the day of her grandmother's funeral. She was too devastated to notice that. Time went on. One day Niko asked Ryan to take her to the village, where she was going to sort through the grandmother's belongings. The groom took their arrival at the village as a pretext to discuss the fact that both the apartment and the house had been given to Niko mistakenly, and the property should be returned to the rightful owners, him and his mother. And to Niko's great shock, in his desire to get what he wanted, he almost turned to insults. Niko felt tears welling up. Feeling suffocated, the young woman rushed out into the yard and walked for a long time until her heart stopped racing. Only then she turned back. Niko was about to enter the house when she overheard her fiancé talking on the phone. The content of the conversation shocked her. "Don't worry, my dear, it won't take long. I'll make her return everything. Yes, of course, before the wedding. She'll do it. But it's a bit more complicated with her apartment. We'll sell it after the wedding and get a bigger one. So it would be considered joint property. Plus, this little house and my grandmother's apartment. We'll get it all. We'll live happily ever after, don't worry. Take care of yourself, my little bunny. Enough talk. She'll be here any minute. I'll tell her I'm going to work, and then I'll come to your place. Wait for me." Niko felt as if she had been punched in the chest and the head at the same time. How could Ryan do this? Who gave him the right to deceive and manipulate like this? Something must be done, right now, immediately, otherwise I will go crazy thinking about why Ryan has done this to me. Taking a deep breath, Niko straightened her back and said to Ryan mentally, "Well, no, my sweetheart, you've picked on the wrong one." Niko entered the house and went straight to the bedroom. Ryan was sitting there alone, twirling his phone in his hands. Now she knew his secret, and his tricks wouldn't work on her any more. After his revelations on the phone, she could see right through this deceitful and self-serving man who thought he could toy with other people's emotions. "Honey, I've been urgently summoned to work again." Ryan began to lie inspiringly. "So I'll leave now and come back tomorrow to take you home. You take your time here. Do everything here properly." "Oh, come on," Niko replied calmly, not giving him a second thought. "There's no need to come back. I'll come back on my own, and you on your own. And give me back the keys to my apartment, please, right now. You're not going back in there, and you're not going back in this house, neither you nor your girlfriend. And you won't get the apartment, neither yours nor mine. And if you disagree, the police can explain your rights. By the way, they and my colleagues are on their way here right now, in case you would like to argue with me." Of course, about the police and colleagues, Niko lied inspiringly, just as Ryan had told her a minute earlier about work. But he couldn't know that, so confidently the girl spoke. Ryan stared silently at Niko's resolute face for a while. Then, with a sharp movement, he threw the keys on the table, covered with an embroidered tablecloth, and headed for the exit. "You're going to be sorry you ever messed with me." He said goodbye, and a minute later, Niko heard the engine start in the car. The girl's first impulse was to sit down and burst into tears right there. But no, she couldn't. She had to act, and fast. Niko quickly ran to the neighbours, with whom she was well acquainted during her past visits, and in 2 hours, new locks were already installed everywhere, on the gate, in the house, and on the outbuildings. No chance for Ryan to slip through. Having finished with the house in the village, and having informed the neighbours and the district policeman about everything, Niko rushed to the city. She had no doubt that Ryan would sooner or later recover from the shock and start acting. Soon the new locks were installed on the door of her apartment. Now came the hardest part, the eviction of Lynette from Martha's apartment. And here Niko, of course, needed a lawyer. She found him through acquaintances. Carlos had not yet had time to establish a practice and win high-profile cases. He was simple and modest, but ready for feats and accomplishments in his professional field. And he was not presented to the girl in vain as a promising and thoughtful lawyer. Thanks to his efforts, Lynette was evicted from the apartment in a few months, although she desperately resisted. One day, Niko invited Carlos to celebrate their victory. The young man did not refuse. Soon the relationship between Niko and Carlos moved into the category of friendship, and then it turned into love, somehow on its own. After a year and a half of meetings, Carlos proposed to Niko to get married and move in with him. He said that the fate of her 2 apartments could be decided by the girl herself, as she pleased. But in Grandmother Martha's house, they could periodically rest with the whole family. Niko warmly supported the proposal of her beloved, and that's precisely what they did. Now in Martha's house hangs her portrait, which Niko managed to order in the atelier from the old photo. Niko and Carlos's children know very well who it is, and before going to bed, they often send air kisses to the portrait. This is how they were taught by their mother, who likes to repeat that Grandma Martha has become her close soul and a benefactor in this world. And the young woman hopes with all her strength that she and her husband will be able to raise their sons as honest, kind, open, and non-envious people, so that they would never even think of doing such a low and mean thing as Ryan had planned to do to her.